Good evening, everyone, distinguished guests, friends of academia, friends of science. Welcome to this evening. Now, in recent years, it has become increasingly common to view academic institutions and their networks as a special type of diplomatic actors or practitioners of what is often called academic diplomacy, science diplomacy, or knowledge diplomacy. Universities have long served as diplomatic actors in global relations, yet their role in informal diplomacy remains under-examined. Through knowledge networks and academic partnerships, these institutions maintain international cooperation when traditional diplomacy struggles, quietly shaping relations through collaboration and trust. So this quote is from a web page that belongs to the University of London Institute in Paris. It describes some of the results from their most recent knowledge diplomacy workshop that was held in Paris on the 5th of June, 2025. Maybe some of you were there. And according to the website, the event revealed how academic institutions are not just responding to global challenges, but actually shaping international relations. Across Europe, more than 52 university alliances encompass 600 institutions. They are actively engaged in what one of the keynote speakers termed informal diplomacy. And the most significant work of these alliances, it is said, is often what happens away from the spotlight. It happens in the countless exchanges, partnerships, and collaborations that keep societies connected, even when official diplomatic channels face strain. So this is the claim. And academies such as this one, and Marit has already mentioned it, also have their alliances and network, such as, for instance, the International Science Council, where one of our distinguished speakers today is the president-elect, Robbert Dijkgraaf. And these associations will also often describe themselves in the same way, namely as academic diplomats. Okay, I'm a philosopher. I'm trained to ask critical questions, and sometimes to be the devil's advocate. And I have sometimes asked myself what lies behind academia's self-understanding as a special kind of diplomat, hence this meeting. And it occurred to me that maybe this idea of being an academic diplomat might be the result of what I see as an interesting dialectic between two conceptions of science, or to be a result of that kind of dialectical movement. Because on the one hand, you have the classical ideal of science as an uncompromised search for truth, governed by the Popperian principle of falsification. So that is the classical ideal. But on the other hand, you have the more sociological understanding of science as a consensual enterprise governed by the quest for collegial recognition and success. So what could be the dialectical result of these two opposing views? Well, maybe academic diplomacy. For even though scientific endeavors may fall short of the classical ideal, or that's what the sociological conception says, maybe if academics and their institutions can partake in academic diplomacy, this might reconstitute their moral standing in the actual world. Okay, so much for my own little philosophical idea. Now to someone else. David Frost is famous for having said, "Diplomacy is the art of letting someone else have your way." So now I start wondering, but what then is the art of academic diplomacy? Who is having their way then? And how does it complement or compete with diplomacy in a formal sense? What are the strengths of academic institutions and network when being allegedly such diplomatic actors? And what are good examples of successful academic diplomacy? Are the results unique and dependent upon these types of actors, say, as opposed to sports events, religious congregations, whatsoever? Now, to answer these questions and spark an informed debate, we have invited two keynote speakers. Marit has already told you who they are, and you have read the program, so you know who they are. And they are particularly well placed, I think, to understand the phenomenon of academic diplomacy. And the first speaker out is, and I had to ask several times how to pronounce her name, Hilligje van Land. Is that somehow in the right direction? She's Secretary General of the the International Association of Universities. It is a global NGO with UNESCO status. And she is obviously an advocate for higher education as a key stakeholder for the UN Agenda 2030, transforming our world. And Hilligje is, no, that was not the name. Hilligje is all over talking about these things, and she's very well placed to answer some of my, I wouldn't say worries, but my critical philosophical ideas. Our second speaker today is Professor Robbert Dijkgraaf. He's a theoretical physicist, but in this capacity of being invited here, it's more because of his work, not the least as a Minister of Education, Culture and Science in the Netherlands. And he has also been my equivalent, although some were even more advanced, maybe the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And as of January 25, he's the president-elect for the International Science Council. And actually, Hilligje and Robbert have just signed something here in the room, so that is also funny. Now, after their presentations, we will have comments from a peace research scholar, Professor Håvard Hegre, who has a lot of knowledge about what leads to war and conflict, and what could be solutions, at least from the structural point of view. And we have also invited a real diplomat, Kai Eide, who will come, both of Håvard and Kai will have comments to the talks. And afterwards, we will rearrange a little bit, have a panel discussion where we will also open up for questions from the public. So I look forward to this evening together with you, and I invite Hilligje to come up.
So I have to apologize for my name, I understand. So we can start with that, and any form, shape works. So in Dutch it would be Hilligje van het Land, and there are quite a few in the room who would be able to pronounce it correctly. And I see that the Dutch are ruling the world now in the sciences with the International Science Council, and me as Secretary General of the International Association of Universities. And we have a similar tagline: we're the global voice of higher education in the world. And we reach out to 22,000 universities, all the accredited institutions, not the non-accredited institution, because the world of higher education is even larger than the 22,000 higher education institutions that we list in the World Higher Education Database that we maintain in cooperation with UNESCO. And so we've been created by UNESCO for diplomatic reasons, quite interesting as well, back in 1950, and we celebrate 75 years of international cooperation just this year, on 9 December, when we signed the constitution, which was developed between 48 in Utrecht in the Netherlands, and called into life by delegations to UNESCO after Second World War. So you see where it comes from and where my mandate, which started in 2017, was really very much rooted into diplomatic dynamics of intercultural learning and understanding around the world to defeat the wars in the minds of people and build peace instead. Not an easy task, and I see that we have not reached that point today, but that there are always avenues that can actually also build bridges beyond the divides that we know around the world. So threats, challenges, and opportunities, the role of academic institutions and their coalitions in the world on fire. It's a very broad topic. It's a wonderful topic. It's one that is very up to date, and I'm very pleased to be speaking in front of this very esteemed audience, and thank you, the Academy, here for inviting me to speak to you, and I look forward to a conversation after the few points I will try and make. So it's really an honor to join today at a moment when the world feels, in every sense of it, on fire indeed. Some of these fires are literal. You mentioned it, wars, burning cities, destroyed campuses, displaced communities. Others are more metaphorical, but no less damaging. Rising authoritarianism, deep polarization, disinformation ecosystems, the climate emergency, or the accelerating disruptions brought by artificial intelligence. Today, universities are being called to do more than educate, more than do research, more than innovate. They're being called to act as stabilizers, connectors, and diplomatic actors. Institutions that can build bridges when politics falters, that can sustain dialogue when official channels close, and that can keep the long arc of knowledge cooperation intact even when the international system is strained. Yet they have to do more with less. Less political and financial support, less social support. So I suggest to explore these three things: the threats before us as a sector, the challenges within us as a sector, and the opportunities ahead of us as a sector and as society, particularly the opportunity to strengthen academic diplomacy, leaving scientific diplomacy to Robbert Dijkgraaf. And I would like, above all, to reflect on the role of academic institutions and their networks in navigating and shaping this moment. Indeed, in a world of fire, what can universities do when we are seeing geopolitical fractures that unsettle long-standing university cooperation and academic or research partnerships? It's a tragedy. We're witnessing attacks on academic freedom, institutional autonomy, sometimes overt, sometimes subtle, but always corrosive. We face an information crisis where evidence and truth compete daily with manipulated narratives. At a time in which we are confronted with the sweeping transformations brought by technology, especially AI, we see that knowledge production is being reshaped. We see that knowledge acquisition is transforming. We see that democracy and democratic processes and the future of work even is developing in a way that even our government's structures cannot keep up with. So in the midst of this, all universities remain, despite all the attacks on the sector, among the few nationally, regionally, and globally engaged institutions still trusted to speak in the language of evidence and scientific truth, of long-term responsibility and of integrity. Indeed, academic partnerships often continue, even when political relations collapse. Academic networks can reopen channels that official diplomacy cannot. Indeed, the sector is thus facing serious threats, and recently Jamil Salmi from the World Bank listed quite a few. And so he started with the erosion of trust. Where does it come from? We're indeed living through a crisis of validity, of even legitimacy. Universities are considered too elitist. We are talking again about ivory towers, but universities are not ivory towers, but it's an easy way to put universities at a distance. They're considered too expensive. In some parts of the world, they are. Not affordable, and indeed, it comes at a cost. But this investment is so important. It's also deemed to be not relevant, which is untrue. It's subject to fraud or corruption, which too often also happens. We discussed it just over coffee. Subject to culture wars. And then there's a lack of trust in expertise that is contested, even if the contrary is also true. Facts are being politicized. Universities, once seen as neutral guardians of knowledge, are increasingly drawn into ideological battles. This erosion of trust weakens not only our educational mission, it undermines our diplomatic authority, our ability to convene, mediate, and build bridges. We cannot invite who we want anymore, and it makes it extremely complicated. This leads to fragmentation. Geopolitical tensions are fragmenting research ecosystems, mobility flows, and collaborative networks. They challenge years of careful crafting of multilateral dynamics, research opportunities, and networking. Because it's careful crafting, it takes years to build very good partnerships. And the relatively new responsible internationalization agenda and policies, as adopted in particular in Europe, by European Commission in particular, is reinforcing this fragmentation, unfortunately. The new agenda, responsible internationalization, envisages to impose, to risk assess each university cooperation and exchange opportunities in the future. Imagine where we would go. At a recent summit organized by a selection of European university alliances, I hope you're familiar with these constructions in Europe, the European Commission Deputy Head International Cooperation, Bojan Glas, announced the development of new guidelines to frame future risk assessment processes, aiming more specifically at framing safe research partnerships and collaborative research processes in projects with potential dual-use implications, and how they would assist universities in navigating the new security agenda and the resulting new research complexity. Well, not very happy with that. In the same vein, he announced that the European Commission's future funding landscape will, on the one hand, be built on openness. We have to remain open. And at the same time, he closed the door in the next sentence. On the other hand, indeed, he said that this new Commission's future funding landscape will be redefined within a new safe values and responsibilities framework, more thoughtful, more safe, more grounded in European values, away from other values, and not even in dialogic dynamics within values around the world. He suggested that the European universities and institutions should work more closely with institutions from like-minded countries, imagine, and that universities should focus on working with trusted partners, who's going to define those, while trying to stay open to cooperation in the best way possible with countries that are not considered like-minded. Complicated, no? So I'm being provocative here because I hope that will fuel our conversation later. So this is really worrisome as we see it. After 75 years of careful crafting of partnerships, this is the opposite. It's deconstructing these opportunities for working together. Who would be in charge, indeed, of implementing such a program? Who would bear the responsibility even of screening individuals or partnerships, of actioning a green or red light to or away from a research partnership or an exchange opportunity? Who's going to do that? In the institution? Somebody outside, not knowing the institution? Very complicated. What would be the added value of these processes? I'm almost tempted to say none. We are at risk of seeing the world close in again. We're not as much at risk of losing something when entering a partnership, but rather we're at risk of no longer gaining from the incredible opportunities fair and inclusive, non-traditional, different and not like-minded cooperation partnerships and collaborative processes come with. The risks of non-cooperation may be much, much higher than the opposite. And this you can also read in a very interesting report that was just issued by STUNT. You probably know the Swedish organization that's looking at international relations and how they operate. We would only impede or even block knowledge development. This is quite short-sighted view on development overall. Knowledge development can anyhow not be boxed. Even if you close it up, it will still travel the world, despite everything that we will try. Indeed, the global fragmentation that the new agenda will endanger is the opportunity for universities to fulfill their role as last remaining channels of cross-border cooperation. When academic ties weaken, we lose not only scientific progress, but also diplomatic pathways built on decades of trust and shared practices. And thus, our values are becoming more vulnerable than ever. Academic freedom, institutional autonomy, the right to education, these are rights which come with responsibility from us all. They require to be defended, they demand practices that uphold integrity and inclusiveness, and when these values are threatened, the diplomatic voice of higher education becomes muted, and the world loses an essential stabilizing force. So the threats and challenges, they come both from within and from without. I would like to say they define the work universities can or must do to remain credible actors on the local and global stage. Indeed, they challenge what universities are for. You've heard that sentence probably more and more lately. Not what universities are good at, but what are they good for? And universities are called to clarify their purpose and how they actually serve the global public good. They now should expand and safeguard knowledge. They cultivate critical, responsible, globally aware citizens. In one word, they actually foster curiosity. Universities advance the public good and advocate for multilateralism. They hold space for complexity and nuance. Nuance is very important, a rare commodity today, as we know. They allow to become more inclusive, more accessible. They develop social licenses to co-create the knowledge needed to address the global challenges we face. They foster ethical, equitable, and inclusive collaboration opportunities, and they foster innovation. So this clarity is essential if we want to grow our credibility as academic diplomats. And we need to strengthen our resilience similarly. Resilience is not just financial. It is intellectual, cultural, and moral. Higher education institutions must remain open to the world while mitigating geopolitical risks. Yes, they must build governance structures capable of withdrawing political pressure. They must adapt to any influence that may come through AI and a digital transformation without compromising educational principles. A resilient university is a credible diplomatic actor. And then they need to balance everything, the local, the national, the global. Universities are not ivory towers. They're deeply local, embedded in communities. They're actually true anchor institutions. They're also inherently global at the same time, because they're part of the transnational knowledge ecosystem. Managing this dual identity, and you talked about other tensions as well earlier, is a diplomatic challenge in itself. It requires institutions to listen locally, cooperate regionally, contribute globally, sometimes all in one and the same decision that universities have to take. So whether they name it as such or not, universities already practice diplomacy by negotiating recognition of qualifications, by hosting scholars at risk, by maintaining research ties across conflict lines, by participating in regional and global networks, by advocating for academic freedom and open science. This is diplomacy grounded not in power, but in knowledge, in trust and values. It requires skills, coordination, and coalitions. Even in a world on fire, there are also opportunities. And these opportunities come with responsibilities that can transform the higher education's role into a better one for the future. So the opportunities are opportunities to reaffirm core values, opportunities to rebuild trust and democracy, opportunities to shape AI ethically and strategically, opportunities to strengthen academic diplomacy. Indeed, recognizing the opportunity to reaffirm core values is essential. Crises clarify what matters. Now is the time to assert boldly and publicly that universities are places of independence, dialogue, and truth-seeking. And they stand on very strong values, and academic freedom and institutional autonomy are the cornerstone of those. But it's also inclusion, it's openness, it is co-creation and cooperation. The second one, opportunity to rebuild trust and democracy. Universities help societies understand complexity, navigate uncertainty, resist manipulation. Through research, civic education, public engagement, and open science, we can rebuild trust in knowledge and science. And this too is diplomacy, diplomacy with society. You see, I'm an optimist. We can do a lot. There's also the opportunity to shape AI ethically and strategically in order to defeat the manipulations in the future. So AI presents risks, yes, but also extraordinary possibilities. If universities lead rather than follow, they can help ensure AI strengthens rather than undermines democracy, inclusion, and knowledge integrity. But can they, in the current context? Are they facilitated? Are they supported? This is a diplomatic project in itself, negotiating norms, shaping global standards, building ethical frameworks, and it needs to be supported more strongly moving into the future. And that's how we can strengthen academic diplomacy. This is one of the most powerful opportunities we have before us. In an era of geopolitical tensions, academic diplomacy is often the last best functioning form of international dialogue. Universities can maintain scientific cooperation across political divides. They can create safe spaces for global conversations. They can support displaced students and scholars and preserve knowledge flows when borders close. Universities and their associations and networks, often misunderstood in their capacity to bring people together and to really serve society, serve as multilateral diplomatic platforms which should be interconnected. And that's why we signed an agreement today, because we need to be better connected also between the International Science Council and the International Association of Universities. Because that connection will help amplify the voices of sciences and of the universities in their capacity to act. Academic diplomacy is not symbolic, it is strategic, it's stabilizing, and it is urgently needed. So the role of universities and other higher education institutions is multiple. There's the responsibility for integrity of knowledge. There's engagement that is very important. There's solidarity and imagination. Let me very quickly delve a little bit deeper into those. Responsibility for integrity of knowledge. Universities must protect the integrity of knowledge through rigorous scholarship, transparency, courage as well. A sector that cannot safeguard truth cannot serve as a diplomatic actor, and this is a time when the sector needs to come together more strongly despite the differences. It needs to move away from competition into cooperation. And that is something that we uphold very strongly at the IAU, and we navigate the world. We move from one continent to the next with our conferences, with our projects, with our different initiatives, and we always connect the unconnected and try to bring different voices to the table. Then engagement. Engagement today is also diplomatic. We should not be naive, of course, and we should understand the risk of dual-use research outcomes, for instance. Of course we do. But who defines what dual-use could be? Something that we invent today could be dual-use in 20 years. And one of the colleagues, Henk Kummeling, the former rector of Utrecht, said, one dual use of, for instance, a mouse or this can be that if I throw it at you, it becomes an arm. It becomes something that is dangerous. So should we have developed this? Maybe not. It's dangerous for the future. I'm making a joke. So we should not be naive, we understand, yet universities should not be forced to over-securitize research opportunities. On the contrary, higher education institutions must build relationships with government, civil society, the private sector, and international organizations from many different horizons to foster understanding and open doors to the future. They must advocate for evidence-based policies, fair and inclusive mobility frameworks, and academic freedom. Universities are the connectors for the future. In terms of solidarity, that's perhaps the most profound expression of academic diplomacy, when institutions collaborate to recognize qualifications of displaced peoples. You may have heard of the European Passport for qualifications for displaced peoples, which UNESCO now has moved to the global level as well to recognize the diplomas despite absence of papers. And when they support threatened scholars, when they defend colleagues under pressure, they practice diplomacy grounded in values and humanity. And all of this leads to imagination. The world will move into futures that are not yet visible, not even imagined. Universities must help imagination and model those futures, a more sustainable, greener future, a more humane digital ecosystem, a renewed democratic culture. The imaginative and creative capacity, again, is a diplomatic asset rooted in the open confrontation of ideas, the right to fail and try again, the right to explore, meet and learn from each other and grow together. So here is where I come to the end of my talk, and a call to action. Universities have a few things to do. They have to reclaim the narrative. Indeed, if we do not shape the story of higher education, others will define it for us, despite the fact that understanding universities is at times lacking, as was said by Sean Rowland from the Guild the other day. Others often do not do justice to the breadth and width of what the universities stand for, and they push it back into ivory towers. Second, universities need to invest in coalitions. They need to ensure that these coalitions are diplomatic infrastructures of higher education, connecting the unconnected, and keep the doors open to innovation through very different and innovative approaches to each other. And they need to lead by values. So let me close with this. When the world is on fire, institutions have two choices. They can retreat, or they can build something stronger than the flames. The university, at its best, chooses the second. Universities build knowledge, they build trust, they build bridges across borders, disciplines, and identities. They keep doors open when others close them. They protect truth, foster dialogue, and practice diplomacy rooted in humanity rather than power. The fires around us are real, but they're not destiny. If universities recognize and embrace their role as academic diplomatic actors, if our coalitions remain courageous, principled, and ambitious, then higher education can help the world not only survive this moment of crisis, but emerge from it wiser, more resilient, and more humane. And that's why I'm very pleased to have had the opportunity to speak to you here today with a very diverse audience that will allow to build these bridges together. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, a great honor to be back here and with such an important topic. And I must say, I really feel Norway and Norwegian scientists always, in my view, play an extraordinary role in supporting international science collaboration. So it's a particular honor to be here and to be together here with you, Hilligje. And indeed, we signed an accord, so higher education and science, the Oslo Treaty. In this room, we expect a little plaque at some point. No. In some sense, we indeed live in kind of paradoxical times. So let's start by saying that, there are unprecedented opportunities for science. I think new technologies, new ideas, an unparalleled world of talent, and modern technology enables also new levels of connectivity. So I don't think the academic community has ever been so large and so well connected. But then there are all the pressures that you just mentioned, Hilligje, the shrinking space of intellectual collaboration, pressure both from the outside and the inside. We see in many countries around the world, predominantly the United States, bans on sensitive topics like climate, biodiversity, vaccines, gender, social equality. And as you just heard, populists portray universities that often celebrated as a pillar of democracy, as elitist institutions. And for me, the most worrying thing is that some of the polarization in societies is now increasingly along educational fault lines between those who have or have not enjoyed a university education. Then we have scientific consensus that's deliberately undermined, often by disinformation campaigns disguised as legitimate science. Governments, wielding the power of the purse, I would say increasingly free science through the narrow lens of economic competitiveness, and the policies are very skewed towards short-term goals. And the humanities and the social scientists are particularly questioned and marginalized, while they are absolutely crucial to understand how societies adapt to all those technological changes. But perhaps most alarmingly, it's an increasingly inward-looking, zero-sum world. And so international scientific collaboration is reframed as a threat to national security, to economic interests, even as humanity's most pressing challenges, from pandemics to technology governance, demand global cooperation. And a veteran researcher I spoke recently said that this current chilling atmosphere and lack of sharing data is worse than he actually experienced during the Cold War. Ironically, it's exactly the need for these worldwide guidelines to address planetary health, so as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, that triggers some of this fierce backlash. Some groups, often connected to large multinational corporations, view the establishment of global regulation as barriers to unconstrained industrial and technological development, even as evidence of a threatening world government overreach. And indeed, we have to be, some of the political backlash does result actually from the growing impact of science and research, delivering those uncomfortable truths about environmental degradation or social inequality and public health risks. So I like to joke, this is like the social equivalent of Newton's third law. Every action gives an equal and opposite reaction. Science pushes society and society pushes back. And in honest efforts to base policies on solid scientific footing, researchers often face accusations of political bias. Now, some say if you mix science with politics, you get politics, but I think that's an oversimplification. Science and politics have complementary roles and responsibilities. Science must acknowledge that facts inevitably intersect with values and political ideas, but politicians must learn to deal with evidence and nuance. I'd like to say scientists aren't above politics, but politicians also aren't above the facts. Now, under the current geopolitical pressure, and this is really worrying, the multilateral system itself, including the United Nations and its agencies, face tremendous strain and is even actively undermined. Sometimes I describe the International Science Council, which is the oldest and most comprehensive organization representing the global scientific community, as a kind of UN of science. And then people look at me and they say, I hope not. And that's already a sign of the times, I think. But I think, and this is, I think, the theme today, that the academic community has a special and important role to play. Now, governments sit in the front seats of the geopolitical theater, I like to call it the splash zone, but we are in the second ring. It's less charged, it's outside the direct political spotlight, but it offers opportunities. Where political issues divide, science can unite. Climate change, pandemic, technological disruption, they don't respect borders and demand global coordination. But without being naive, and Hilligje, you just mentioned it, we must recognize that research collaborations that build relations that bring countries together. History teaches us that these connections prove extremely valuable. At the founding of the predecessor of the International Science Council at the end of the 19th century, it was noted that scientific contacts often predate economic and political ones. And I think this insight rings truer than ever. Academic institutions possess distinctive strength that formal diplomacy do not. They command legitimacy through their expertise, speaking with an authority that transcends politics. International organizations have a neutral convening power, bringing together researchers even from hostile nations, because scientific norms and shared curiosity can bridge divides. And that relationship works on longer timescales. It builds trust and collaboration across decades that easily outlasts electoral cycles and political crises. the average lifetime of a European minister has been calculated to be less than 22 months. I beat that record. And I think these academic ties are particularly important for low-income countries. They often face the hardest policy decisions with the least access to scientific expertise. So open science, Hilligje already mentioned it, the practice of responsibly sharing research outcomes and data sets, is crucial for making knowledge more equitable and addressing another growing divide, which is the North-South divide. And it ensures that science truly serves as a global public good. Now, a particularly thorny challenge today is research security. We should discuss more about it. Nations increasingly view scientific collaboration through the lens of this strategic autonomy and national security. And these concerns, and they are legitimate concerns, add layers of complexity. Indeed, since these days, almost any form of cutting-edge technology carries strategic economic value and potential dual-use applications, from quantum technology to genetic editing to artificial intelligence. And navigating this requires avoiding both paranoia and naivete. And this tension often comes from an asymmetric perspective. Governments worry that scientists are naive, and scientists worry that governments are paranoid. And this demands broad engagement, particularly, I think, engagement from the scientific community. These distinctions require fine surgery, not a blunt axe. So I think there are many areas where actually international collaboration does make sense to the benefit of all. So to say, where it's in the nation's strict self-interest to collaborate. I first want to mention fundamental, basic research. Fields like mine, like particle and astrophysics, have a long tradition and I would say exemplary role in bringing the world together. These large-scale infrastructures are beyond the technological, financial, and organizational means of individual nations. And, curiosity-driven science can have tremendous impact on society. I actually wrote a little book, The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge, that gives many examples. But history teaches us that those benefits cannot be captured by a single nation. You can think, for instance, about the invention of the World Wide Web at the particle physics laboratory CERN. Actually, CERN creation in 1954 is an interesting and successful example of academic diplomacy, actually disguised as a scientific project. After World War II, all European nations wanted to collaborate with the United States on nuclear matter. But America was reluctant to share sensitive weapons technology. Instead, the US encouraged European nations to work together on particle physics, rebuilding European scientific capacity and keeping their nuclear secrets separate. So this brought former enemies like France and Germany together as equal partners in a pan-European institution way before the European Economic Community was created. It stemmed the brain drain from European scientists to America. It fostered European integration and actually created a rare East-West dialogue during the Cold War. In fact, several European countries joined CERN before they joined the European Union. An ambitious attempt to replicate this bridge-building success in a conflict-ridden region is Sesame. Sesame is a facility established in 2017 in Jordan, and it brings together scientists from the Middle East to conduct research using a synchrotron light source. It's a rare neutral place where Israeli and Palestinian scientists work side by side, and the Iranian researchers collaborate with regional counterparts from Egypt and Turkey. While the facility faces ongoing and increasing challenges, you can well imagine, it demonstrates that the CERN model of academic diplomacy can be adapted to even the world's most intractable geopolitical fault lines. A second domain in obvious need of global cooperation is planetary challenges. The atmosphere and the oceans know no boundary. Actually, Norway is very strongly represented in ocean research. And as you know, viruses travel unrestricted around the world, and it's in each country's interest to have access to global data for impending climate disasters or emerging pandemics. An inspiring example was the launch of the International Geophysical Year in 1957-1958 by the predecessor of the ISC. It was during the height of the Cold War. It achieved landmark scientific discoveries, the Van Allen belt, radiation belts around the Earth, the conformation of mid-ocean ridges supporting plate tectonics. It established permanent Antarctic research centers, and it demonstrated that scientists from 67 countries could work, including Cold War adversaries, could collaborate successfully. It led directly to one of the most successful diplomatic initiatives, the Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1959, the year after, which designated Antarctica as a scientific preserve, banned all military activities, and established free scientific investigation and cooperation, enabling crucial climate research. Another successful example is the establishment of IISA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. It was founded in 1972 in Austria, outside Vienna, as a bridge between East and West during the Cold War. The initiative came from the US and Soviet presidents, who saw value in creating a space where scientists from both blocs could work together on shared challenges like energy, population, environment, and food. What made IISA remarkable is also its structure. It was not a UN body or an intergovernmental organization, but rather a non-governmental research institute funded by the member countries' academies and research councils. The German National Academy, Leopoldina, offers another powerful example, the role academies can play. It was founded in 1652. I think Leibniz was one of the founders. It's based in Halle, and that became part of East Germany. The Leopoldina uniquely maintained its all-German character during the Cold War. It continued electing members from East and West and held joint meetings where West German scientists traveled across the Iron Curtain to Halle, albeit with onerous formalities and very strict control. In this way, it maintained personal relationships between the scientists who otherwise had very limited contact. So after the Wende, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the Leopoldina's unique position gave it a crucial bridge-building function during reunification. There were personal networks built through decades of joint membership, which allowed the Leopoldina scientists to, for instance, evaluate credibly each German institutions, and it helped to integrate Eastern scientists and bridge divergent scientific cultures. So I think the question for us right now is whether the global scientific community possesses the imagination and the determination to forge similar new partnerships, ambitious partnerships, and capable of pushing back against those divisive geopolitical forces, from fragmentations and undermining international collaboration. I think the scientific and the societal imperatives for cooperation have never been more compelling. We face many planetary challenges, already mentioned them: climate change, pandemic preparedness, biodiversity loss, the oceans, that recognize no borders and whose solutions demand coordinated global action. And also the fundamental questions driving modern science increasingly require resource and expertise beyond any nation's capacity. So I think the path forward requires not naivete about, genuine economic autonomy or security concerns, but rather creative new institutional designs that can preserve the open exchange of ideas. And in my view, and I want to close with that, Europe has a special role to play. First of all, Europe has a unique research ecosystem. It's based on this kind of funny mix of collaboration and competition, embracing pluralism and connectedness to the world. Modern science was in some sense Europe's gift to the world, but with a refreshing openness to other perspectives and cultures, particularly to Islamic science and ancient sources of knowledge. Second, I think in research, Europe's often criticized complexity and inertia can become features instead of bugs. So viewed from the other point of view, they provide stability and predictability. I think these are essential conditions of scientific excellence. I like to say Brussels kind of average out the volatility of national politics. The third thing I think is cooperation. Now, Europe has an open, complicated architecture that enables flexible partnership. Of course, the 27 member states form an inner core, but there are these kind of circles of more or less similar-minded nations. In the second ring, we have now 20 countries formally associated to the European framework. Of course, Norway, but also United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand, South Korea, and hopefully soon Japan. And there are many other countries looking for bilateral partnerships. So I think Europe already transcends its geography in the domain of science. But finally, and this might be controversial, but I think there are this more powerful weapon, which is the values. There's a well-known saying that politics is downstream from culture, that broad cultural developments often determine political outcomes, not the other way around. And I think Europe has an opportunity to stand for some universal values that science thrives on. Being inclusive, being transparent, integrity, Hilligje already mentioned it. And most important, I think, academic freedom. To investigate everything, particularly those areas that are politically sensitive, like climate and vaccines and gender. So perhaps the soft power could prove Europe's hardest competitive edge. So, echoing a little bit Hilligje's words, I think this path forward demands some boldness of thinking by the academic community. I think the first thing we have to do is organize ourselves better. I was also Minister of Gender Equality, and I learned the phrase push back against the pushback. And I think this is something that the scientific community should do too. We need science that crosses borders. We need challenges that unite, not divide. And academic institutions then create space for cooperation that perhaps formal diplomacy cannot. So it's definitely not a moment to retreat, but to demonstrate that we can move forward. So I like to say, geopolitics is too important to leave to politicians. Thank you very much.
Dear distinguished colleagues, so thanks for the opportunity to participate in this stimulating event. I've had a chance to comment on the highly inspiring and passionate and insightful speeches by Hilligje and Robbert. Of course, I don't really disagree with anything, and I could have just sit myself down and say here. But I'll try to say a bit more than that. So we all agree to all the basic premises of this conversation, so that current trends in the world are deeply alarming, that core academic values such as academic freedom, transparency, institutional autonomy, and the right to education is essential. We cannot underemphasize the commitment to an understanding of these trends and other phenomena that is based on empirical evidence and explanations that respect scientific logic and rigor. So it's absolutely true that we as academics have an important role to play in efforts to build a better society simply by upholding those values and to defend them from the threats pointed out by Dr. van 't Land. We also agree that academic ties and networks are important bridges in an increasingly fragmented world. I'll try to provide a few contrarian comments, mainly pointing out some challenges and caveats that we face given this agreement. So I'm a peace and conflict researcher, and absolutely concur that we cannot leave geopolitics to politicians. That's kind of in my academic DNA. I come from an academic tradition that used to have a very optimistic view on the future of the world. So the long peace from 1945 to about 2010, and the associated expansion of representative institutions that defined the world up to 2010 was fully in line with the vision of Immanuel Kant in his book called Eternal Peace, where a world resembling this image was the natural outcome of human learning and moral development, even when assuming that people are essentially driven by self-interest, as long as they're rational and well-informed. So, but in some extent that optimism is shattered today, and the long peace seems gone. But the changes we see today are not driven by fundamental change in human nature, but by the reemergence in global politics by political leaders that are much less constrained by citizens, so exemplified by the regimes of Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. So in a way, in my view, the main things that is going wrong is the lack of constraints of political leaders. So what is the role of the academic community to counter these recent trends and to retighten the constraints that on political leaders? The academic community is specialized in keeping us rational and well-informed and building a shared perception of reality, as Dr. Dijkgraaf says. We all agree that upholding our scientific standards rooted in the norms of human rights is essential to build good societies. Academic networks are also necessary to ensure we all learn from each other and divide compartmentalized silos of knowledge. However, I'd like to remind us that we fortunately are not alone in this. Constraining self-interested elites is a task for all of society, and we have a good company of civil society actors, of journalists, the free press, opposition politicians, and crucially, the multitudes of international domestic economic actors. So to place the importance of academic networks in the wider context of the importance of networks and interdependence among groups of the global society. So one caveat is that the international academic network is much smaller than the global networks of trade and of international migration and of civil society actors. That may be prudent not to overstate our relative importance. Yes, CERN has been important to build bridges within Europe and beyond, but the European Coal and Steel Union, formed 2 years earlier, was likely much more important. This does not really diminish the value of academic networks, but when it comes down to constraining leaders, economic forces have power that are beyond comparison. Another comment is somehow I'm not entirely at ease with the term academic diplomacy as something more active than a civil society-like web of academic interactions and the commitment to practicing good science to inform societies to make them able to make good decisions. And active engagement in academic diplomacy can also bring with it some dangers. So as academics, we are completely reliant on public trust in us as neutral observers and analysts that base all our assessments on sound scientific practice. It's our primary public obligation. It's our primary obligation to put forward objective and nuanced, coherent and well-informed analysis, as has been said repeatedly, of the facts and to transparently recognize our uncertainties. We need to state these clearly within a complete argument for why we reach the conclusions we reach. But diplomats, they serve a different function. They cannot always afford to be principled in this way. They need to be pragmatic, to choose the lesser of evils and to refrain from speaking up if that serves a larger purpose, such as maintaining a channel of communication with problematic regimes. If academics go down that road, we might possibly risk undermining the very foundation of what's valuable in what we do and to erode that. There are also many practical and challenges and sometimes dangers in maintaining academic networks. In my field, it's often impossible to find academic counterparts in conflict-prone countries. Very often they, as public sector employees under more or less authoritarian governments, are forced to shy away from a Western academic that speaks freely about the benefits of democratization and the detrimental role of poorly constrained and corrupt politicians for keeping the peace. So they don't want to go there. They are better off just reading our research and using this where it's most useful for them. So then this academic practice, which is important, not so much in networks. Also, in some places, these academic networks, they don't exist. In Darfur, they don't exist. And also, as was said, there is some tendency that some of the polarization in US society is against it's the academics versus non-academics, and in that case, also the academic networks are missing where they might be doing the best. So also academics will also risk being used in government's information strategies that run against our principles. A few years back, I was invited to a conference in Tel Aviv on the democratic peace in the Middle East region. But before accepting, I asked to see the participant list, and then saw there was not a single Arab name. Whether that was the bias from the organizer, or whether it was impossible to have any from the neighboring countries to travel into Israel. I'm not sure, but still, I didn't want to be part of to be kind of international alibi for something that would that wasn't a real network. That was absolutely lopsided. So the point here is that politics also interferes with academic practice, and we should make sure our networks not showcasing a harmony that does not exist. So many such constraints are obviously much less important for other fields, and my caveats are mostly comments in margins to highly stimulating talks. So with this in mind, I agree that we as academics and our institutions have a role and obligation to contribute to countering the actions of ill-intended or misinformed actors. That upholding the basic academic principle is essential to help building a better world. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for two very interesting introductions and also the comment. I feel really a bit sorry because I'm not of the caliber that you are, of course. I'm not an academic almost. I managed to get through my exam at the university, but barely, very barely. And after I joined the foreign ministry, in fact. But I do have some experience from the ground. And I think it's obvious that science and the academia has a role to play that is not played today. And it will become even more important in the future. And then you have to think about what does it mean really, academic diplomacy? What kind of conflicts are we talking about? What stage of a conflict? What can we do in various circumstances? Let me just mention 3 or 4 examples here. Peacetime diplomacy, where there is no ongoing conflict, but there may be a potential. Yesterday I listened to an old friend and colleague from NATO. His name is Nick Burns. He was ambassador to NATO with me. He was also now, he just came back after having been Biden's ambassador to China. His big complaint was there are almost no US students studying Mandarin anymore. They're out. And also the level of the number of Chinese students in the US is severely down. That's a serious problem. It's a very serious problem. And we should certainly do what we can to augment again the number of people who go to China, to the US, or vice versa in between US and China, but also to Russia. That today is almost impossible because of the war. But it's quite obvious, and I think we're losing a lot from that. We're losing something that we have had for decades in our country, which is a high level of expertise on Russian affairs. It's vital for our country, and we certainly have to start reinvesting in that knowledge as soon as we possibly can. And the other way around. That's one example. Another, completely different, is there are conflicts that we can see coming, this inevitably will come. And again, I go back to my own experience. I was lucky enough towards the end of my career to travel a lot in the Sahel. It was really the war in Libya that started it all, but I traveled in Sahel, and we could all see what was happening. There was a population explosion coming. These are some of the poorest countries on the globe, and we had no attention on that, no attention at all. We knew that there would be instability. And then there was a very good foreign minister called Bazoum from Niger. And if any of you have been in Niger, you will see that in the capital, if you go 200, 300, 400 meters outside the center of town, it's desert. And I was there visiting him, and I said, what would you like to do when you come to Norway? Would you like to give a speech at an institute, Norwegian Foreign Policy Institute, or whatever? He said, no, 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 no. I want to go to the agricultural university outside of Oslo. And I will bring with me agricultural experts. What did he need? He needed people to bring his country out of the situation it was in. Academics, scientists, you know. I was surprised, but he spent an entire day out there. For him, that was conflict prevention at an early stage. So, just as examples, then we come to the real conflict prevention phase, you know, real conflict prevention phase, which is you see a conflict coming. It looks almost inevitable, and we should address it in one way or another. And yet, you know, I don't know how many times I've heard about improving our ability to do conflict prevention at the UN, in EU context, etc., but it never happens. We never react, we never, before we have a real crisis to respond to, which is amazing, because it certainly would save us a lot of money if we manage to act when we see things coming. But it seems that we are unable to do it. Unable to do it. Then when conflicts really burst out and we are in the middle of it, then comes another problem. The ambassador of Kosovo, who is here, I'm very pleased to see you, participated many years ago in something that we call the post-pessimist group. You know, it was a group of young people from Kosovo, from Serbia, from Montenegro, Macedonia, etc., and they all came together because they thought, look, we're not pessimists anymore. This was after the Dayton Agreement. We're not pessimists anymore, but we're not yet optimists. So they were post-pessimists. And they met in Lillehammer and also in the region, and it was really a promising endeavor. And some of them still have contacts. But then the war in Kosovo came, and the bombing of Serbia, and the centrifugal forces became too strong, and the group really splintered. I'm sorry about my voice. And splintered. It was very, very difficult to keep them together. And that's where we are today also. When it comes to the Palestinian crisis, when it comes to the Ukrainian war. I went to the opera a few weeks ago. It was a premiere night on Eugene Onegin. Yevgeny Onegin, I guess it is in Russian. And what happened was the lady who introduced the show, you know, she, there's half an hour before the opera, somebody is going through what is going to happen, what you're going to see. And she started by saying, almost in an apologetic way, I hope you accept that we today, even in the middle of this war, have Tchaikovsky on our program. And I thought, how sad to say such a thing. Because Tchaikovsky is not only a Russian icon, he belongs to the global heritage, you know. But she felt that, and it illustrated to me so much what happens with regard to sports, with regard to arts and music, etc., and probably also to academia. When war breaks out and sanctions are imposed, then we're all affected in one way or another. And it's very, very difficult to keep together the kind of work that you also want to endeavor on. Let me finally say on the post-conflict, in post-conflict situations, and you gave me 2 minutes, I could see 3. That's very generous. post-conflict situations require patience, And I remember seeing that from Bosnia. I was UN representative to Bosnia, 97, 98. And there's one thing I regret so much, and that is all the visitors who came, who did they want to see? They wanted to see the wartime leaders. They didn't want to see the young generation. They wanted to see the important people, Izetbegovic, etc., etc. And constantly we said to them, please go and see the young people. Please go to the universities. Please establish networks. But there wasn't an interest. And we didn't have the patience to develop the kind of broader networks that would enable them to grow together again. Then the 2 last minutes I'm going to use to point to 2 aspects where I really think science today will be of critical importance. And that is arms control. Arms control. Until now, arms control was for military and politicians. It was for ministries of defense, high commands, etc., etc. Today, states do not have monopoly over weapons development anymore, as we had during the emergence of nuclear weapons. These weapons are developed by tech firms. And they are dual use. They can be used for civilian and military purpose. They can be used for defensive and offensive operations. They are invisible, sometimes impossible to define. What is a cyber weapon, for instance? Cyber weapons, drones, artificial intelligence, that will be the key elements in any future discussions on arms control. And we need science and scientists in order to manage, in order to find out how do we go about it. Is it possible in the future to construct arms control agreements, or are we really beyond that stage? I hope certainly that we are not. I wish I now had some very wise word here to round up, but we have a discussion afterwards. So that's all I have to say for the moment.
We will now rearrange a little bit. The 4 speakers will take their chairs here behind the desk, and we will have some discussion, and we will have the opportunity for questions from the audience. But let me just now take the opportunity to ask the 2 of you who gave the first 2 talks. How would you respond to the point from the research, peace and conflict researcher, Håvard, about the magnitude of other, like NGOs and all sorts of other organizations and civil society? What is so special about us? After all, we're not that big.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the comments that both you delivered, which really will allow to also look at some of the points made and improve them. So thank you very much for those. On the point, what I retained from your first comments was really, are academics always able to be academics and at the same time diplomats? And is that a possibility? And how can they engage also in networks, even when networks don't seem to be possible? You gave the example of countries where individuals, academics, will not be able to engage in associations and networks. because of political reasons, or because they've been appointed by the government and they cannot speak freely, because of many different aspects, and we can name them. It's in China, you see it in Turkey, you see it in many countries around the world, where indeed taking a stand and speaking up is not always an opportunity. But what I always hear in the work that I do, and I've been doing over so many years, also before when I was a professor of comparative literature and very much involved in intercultural learning and dialogue dynamics, they still are extremely pleased that these networks do exist. And as you said, they will find a way and their way into reading about the work that's being done. And there is always a hope that there will be a new day when they will be able to speak up, and they will have the freedom to engage in the conversations. And the diplomacy comes in through civil society much more broadly than through the academic world that is rooted in disciplines. It's also the whole artistic part, that's the arts and humanities that are offered by universities, so through theater groups that travel through the Sahel and into Africa, connect people through means that are not seen by politicians as being so problematic and at risk of even undermining the more authoritarian regimes. But these are very subtle ways of moving still into dialogical opportunities to discuss the way in which we can still build bridges between peoples and build the peace that you were talking about. The other aspects that I would like to get back to, are we able to anticipate? Are we future thinking? Are we able to hear the sounds and anticipate the wars of tomorrow? And I believe that often, or maybe I would like to believe, and I'm very optimistic here, but there's a lot of research that's being done that shows where problems are growing. The Arab Spring, for instance, is an example where it was anticipated that there would be an Arab Spring, and that the whole Maghreb region was really suffering from non-recognition of diplomas, for instance, from non-recognition of the opportunities for young people to participate in society, from non-opportunities for them even to become mobile and participate in international collaboration. And so even though the scientific work is there, there's no translation to a broader public. And that's where I see the opportunity for academics to play this more diplomatic role, in the sense that they could engage in writing into newspapers more, they could engage in making their work known through different channels. But that's where today there's another challenge that I didn't have the time to elaborate on, but academics are challenged because they have to do everything at the same time. They have more and more work, they have more and more administration, they have more and more students in their classes, and the endemic growth of their classrooms and makes it difficult to play all the other roles at the same time. And at the same time, are they always equipped? A diplomat is, I would trust, to be educated in being and becoming a diplomat. An academic diplomat, and I don't know about scientific diplomat, are not always educated into it. So it's at times also difficult for them to speak on their behalf and then say, I'm speaking from myself, or I'm speaking on behalf of an institution or on behalf of a network, which is something totally different. And then, are you equipped to play that role to the full? And how does that work? So there are many different things that actually the comments triggered as follow-up questions for the future.
Thank you.
Well, again, thanks for both commentaries. They were very, very inspiring. So to mention a few points, you mentioned the long peace. And I think actually one thing which I see we are witnessing is, I say it's something like the Washington Consensus that appeared after World War II, where I think the US was the primary country that, there's the famous report by Vannevar Bush, who was the the advisor, the science advisor to Roosevelt during the war, and he was asked in 1944, what if this tremendous public investiture in research could possibly mean in peacetime? And that led to, I think, the modern research universities, the Research Council, and we've seen this model around the world. And I think that in some sense, you know, has come not to an end, but I think there is some kind of transition, or some speak even a tipping point to a kind of a new configuration. And what will it be? We don't know, but obviously, you know, we are in a time of transition, I think, also for the whole scientific academic enterprise. Indeed, then the point of, you know, the danger, in some sense, if you get involved with diplomatic, academic diplomacy, that you somehow, you know, I think it's very similar to the interface which I mentioned between science and politics, you know, where you run a risk of scientists, you know, want politics to be scientized or something, and perhaps we want diplomacy to be scientized, but you run the risk of getting the accusation that you're being politicized. So it's a very, very difficult terrain to navigate, I think, you know, and it's clearly, I think, important lesson is at some point you have to stop and leave it to the diplomats, to the politicians. Clearly, you know, I think the academic world is one of many civil societies, but I do say it's very strongly organized. So the fact that we have universities, we have large research laboratories, we have research councils, the kind of architecture of the academic world is quite strong compared to many other organizations. You know, for instance, compared to the arts, which I think is much more fragile. And so another part what we can do is build up academic institutions. So for instance, in ISC, we built up this kind of Pacific Academy, which is a way to connect the small island states in the Pacific, which are very small countries. Some have only like 10,000 inhabitants, but together they're basically responsible for half the planet. And so building these institutions is incredibly important. And then I think, you know, in terms of this kind of student exchange, I think it's an incredibly important point. What I'm missing these days, I see many arguments to not have exchange. But I would say I don't see the arguments to have the exchange and actively promote this. And I think this is something really missing. Actually, also, you know, even in the Cold War, I think, you know, scientists were actively encouraged to have contact with the Soviet Union, to some sense to export, you know, a Western liberal point of view and undermine, so to say, a regime. And in some sense, this kind of active policies I see really missing. And it's very, I think, you know, really worrying that the exchange both with Russia and China and other nations is going down so rapidly. And I think, you know, an overarching point, I think, is that also in our academic scientific world, we should be more aware of our own history in this. So when I was in Princeton, basically had Oppenheimer's job, you know, and there was this, so we live in the same house, and there was this kind of big safe there. It was empty, but it reminded me often, you know, what were the discussions that were held here? And of course, it was a very small group of nuclear scientists that were involved in this, and who were very much aware of their role in government. Of course, you know, they were intensely engaged in arms control. And you know, in some sense, I would say, you know, we are all now sitting behind Oppenheimer's desk. I think, you know, it's so many different technologies, scientific fields have this kind of same dimension. And what I often feel, which I think is missing in the academic world, is that the experience in the various domains are not shared. So you see this in science policy, you see it, I think, in science diplomacy. There are lots of sources of knowledge and experience, but they're kind of in silos within our academy. And I think actually learning from those activities could be a wonderful way to get ahead. I think often, you know, with all these issues, and it's my final point, you know, there are deep questions. But the good thing is, you know, we are the academic community. We have, you know, experts studying this, and I think, say, those who are involved in, say, artificial intelligence or, you know, building autonomous robotics, they are not aware that they could go to people studying this to ask, for guidance, how to operate in this complicated world. So I think, it's a wonderful thing that we have as a scientific academic community. We can have self-reflection, and I think it's very much necessary.
I would last ask the commentators if they have comments to the comments of the keynotes. If not, I will give Kai.
You said leave it to the diplomats and the politicians. For God's sake. Because you see today diplomats without experience in, just one example, arms control. I'm astonished to see the discussions today that take place concerning Ukraine. And to see the, I wouldn't say total, but the lack of experience about what happened over the last couple of decades, for instance, on conventional arms control. In 1999, not so long ago, an agreement was entered into by all the OSCE countries that reduced the number of heavy weapons by between 70 and 80,000, and set a limit to how much each country could have. It was never ratified by the United States for a reason that they considered to be an important reason. I thought it was a bad reason, but it was never ratified. But you don't have that expertise anymore. And I see the meetings of the British, French, and German leaders, and I think, where's their experience? You need people with expertise in completely new fields. And military don't have it, diplomats don't have it, politicians don't have it. But you can, in fact, be important players here. So I think this is one of the areas that I would really single out. Here is your chance to really play an important role in trying to limit the risk of another conflict. And I mean another huge conflict.
Yes, there's just one little point that I wanted to maybe add in the mix for the conversation as well. We're talking quite a bit from the north here. But when you listen to other dynamics like the BRICS Plus, they are not waiting for us to continue to have cooperation, and very strong one and strengthened one between Brazil, Russia, China, South Africa, all the others. And they continue. They travel the world as we don't. And we're losing out even there. And it's amazing to see how these collaborations continue. So the Brazilian colleagues of mine, I'm involved in many different projects in Latin America, they go to Russia 3-4 times a year. South Africa, they're involved in all these dynamics as well. And very interestingly, in a conference last week, a colleague from Stellenbosch said, okay, but if you now in Europe and in the global north, you define these trusted partners and the safe spaces to work together, where does that leave South Africa? We work with all those you don't trust. We work with Russia, we work with China, we work with India, we work with all the others. And so will you discontinue any partnership and collaboration with South Africa now as well? So it's very intriguing because on the one hand, as you say, we need to continue these collaborations. We don't. We've taken a stand. We've made choices. And with my board, made up, it's a UN system there as well with representation of the 5 continents. Some of the board members say, why did you stop cooperation with Russia? Doesn't make any sense. And then the Europeans say, but it does make sense. So it's also there very interesting, even in these dynamics, how to actually ensure that we continue, maybe not the cooperation with the countries, but that we have this opportunity to build bridges at least between the academics and continue the science connections around the world.
Now I open the floor for questions, and we already have one, Kenneth Ruud, who is the director of the, well, you can tell yourself where you come from. It's a very topical place to work these days.
Thank you very much for very, very interesting, inspiring discussions. And I give me a lot to think about. There are many aspects here, and I'll try to be focused and challenging on one particular topic in particular, what do we actually mean by academic diplomacy? And to give a backdrop, I used to be the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research at the University of Tromsø, the Arctic University of Norway, which meant I was heavily involved in science diplomacy with Russia until 2021. 2022, January 1st, I started as the Director General of Norwegian Defense Research Establishment. And 7 weeks into my mandate, there was the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. So this is what I've been struggling with. And let me start by saying this, because this is probably what you don't expect from me to say. International collaboration is essential. I do advocate this when I talk to universities, absolutely collaborate with China and so on, but only after you have considered the values in terms of national security interest of what you're doing. That goes back to what Kai is talking about, knowing what kind of impact a given technology can have. And in terms of how do I think about what you should worry about, think of who can be on the other side, and if you're worried about what you know, or that they know what you know and you don't know how to defend it, think carefully about sharing. So that's a point of view. And just to show why international collaboration is working, I mean, the rise of China is a result of international science collaboration. And it's a good thing. We wanted this. The question now, can it be used against us? And that is perhaps where I go into the core of what do we mean by academic diplomacy. Because there is perhaps an implicit assumption that there is a universal set of values. Because that is important in terms of sharing data, for instance. It's not necessarily that bilaterally agreed, possibly imposed by governments, but also because in perhaps the scientific community, have we lost, occasionally I worry that we have lost the interest to seek knowledge for the purpose of knowledge, and we seek it perhaps more of winning a debate, getting fame. So are we sure that we have a coherency? So what do we actually mean by diplomacy in this context? And going back to Camilla's comment, diplomacy is the art of letting someone else have your way. So is academic diplomacy perhaps the right term?
Thank you, Kenneth. So the challenge is now for the whole panel. Yes, if I see more hands, I think now, yes, please.
Thank you. I'm one of those diplomats, so I feel a little bit on the back foot here. Robbert, you mentioned silos, the risk of silos in science. I see a different development in diplomacy as well as in academia, and that is multidisciplinary approaches in diplomacy, either because of budget cuts, so we are forced to invest less in specialisms and are forced to work more together with different disciplines, or also because the global challenges that we have to solve require more and more a multidisciplinary approach. I think I see the same in academia. Universities that are forced to collaborate more, losing out on studies for small niche groups and work more and more together on the bigger topics. I don't have an opinion on that, whether that's good or bad, but asking you, with the global challenges that we face, is that a good development? Thank you.
Okay, I see another hand.
Good evening, Jan Bayaar, Belgian ambassador here in Norway. Thank you for fascinating presentations. They come as a bit of a follow-up of a discussion I was part of in Reykjavik in October at this annual Arctic conference, where a number of people who are in politics or diplomacy now but grew up in the Soviet Union presented the following view. The very idea of academic diplomacy as a parallel track to government diplomacy, building international bridges of understanding only makes sense in the context of a Western liberal state which respects civil society as an autonomous space. This, and there may be hybrid situations, this was unthinkable in the Soviet Union and is unthinkable today in totalitarian states, because the very definition is that such state is authoritarian, not only about its own state apparatus, but the whole of society. That goes further to what I heard on academics come, but they must keep quiet. No, no academic will ever get permission to travel to any international meeting without pledging allegiance to the intelligence services and accepting that he or she will be part of all the dirty tricks of the game. So I fully adhere to the ambition and the hope that this concept of academic diplomacy carries, but in which context exactly does it really make sense? With whom? So, yeah, that's, sorry to be provocative, but you know.
Oh, exactly. We need these critical questions because we are so easily enthusiastic about our own capabilities, I think. Okay, then we have 3 quite substantive questions for the panel, and I think we only have, well, 10-15 minutes left. So
let me perhaps start with the question, essentially also about research security. And let me share one little anecdote. When I, as Minister of Science, I was very much involved in this topic, and we had a meeting at the Ministry of both the Intelligence and Security Services and a few real leading experts in those fields. And that was kind of a shock. It was a shock in 2 ends. So I think the scientists were a bit shocked by the lack of expertise in intelligence circles, and the intelligence circles were shocked by the lack of consciousness in the scientists that they should actually, this is a topic that they should be engaged with. In fact, they said, you know, we really want you to become aware that you play a role here. And I think this is, for me, a very important lesson, that, you know, the devil is in the details here. And the details will become more and more complicated. And I remember at some point, you know, intelligence service saying anything contained the word quantum is potentially dual use. And, you know, one scientist even angrily left the room. He said, you know, everything is quantum, you know. So 100% of reality. What do you mean? And so I think that's why we need these kind of conversations. And so I think what I said, you have to navigate this kind of very narrow path between naivete and paranoia. I think, you know, and that path becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. So, but in the end, I can't see a solution of these issues without the active engagement of the scientists, because I think the details will start to matter more and more. And then also this question about, you know, are these kind of universal values? Well, obviously, you know, there are some values which are help scientific discovery, you know, being truth, being careful, having various kind of perspectives. But I think we should also be, you know, cognizant that, you know, in the many, many centuries of scientific development, you know, science has blossomed in very hostile environments, you know. In many ways, you know, it has this kind of wonderful role of even in very authoritarian regimes blossoming. You know, a famous example actually is mathematics in the Soviet Union, you know, which was blossoming because they were essentially, there was no role of these mathematicians in universities, so they went in internal exile and found kind of the space that, you know, society couldn't offer them. So, but the question, you know, is is Europe or is current academia fully in line with these values? I think, you know, you quite rightly addressed the point that the academic world is itself, I think, is transitioning, and we see that many of our incentives are perhaps the wrong incentives. Universities are developing, but it's a very important discussion. Then this issue of multidisciplinary versus disciplinary and specialization, well, the easy answer is, of course, we need both. But I think there are two trends. One is that there should also be truth in advertising in science. And I think, we see particularly also in the context of global challenges that a lot of the scientific expertise is not actually being applied. It doesn't provide the results, and that actually weakens the basis, I think, for science. So working transdisciplinary, that is working with other stakeholders, other kinds of knowledge. You can study through satellites the currents of the ocean. Perhaps a local fisherman knows much better what's happening in this particular area. So that, and in terms of specialization, the wonderful thing is that international collaboration actually helps with specialization in the following to give a very concrete example. In the medical field, why would you collaborate? Because there are rare diseases and not a single nation can afford to specialize in that rare disease. But globally we can, in fact. So in some sense there's more space for specialization if we work together. And then I think, finally the realism, I think, that you mentioned. Again, I think, it comes back to my point of this very narrow path. And again, I think here it's an area where, scientists have to be educated, I feel, of the realism in the political world. And I think, again, there's a distinction between collaborating with institutions and collaborating with individuals. But again, that's my personal point of view. There's also perhaps should be a certain proactive role of the academic world in pushing for these values that we feel, are important human values, and that can be transmitted in some way, perhaps in a limited way, through science and higher education.
Håvard is the one who hasn't taken the word yet. Do you want to add something, or?
No, I actually only have more questions than I've noted two questions here, which I think are really intriguing. So I think the question about the importance of the pre-existing liberal society. So is it so that the networks, the academic networks and the academic diplomacy opportunities are only useful if they're embedded in a liberal society that respect human rights and diversity of opinion? So I think that's an enormously important question to ask ourselves. And so could they be useful within the society, within BRICS? So an academic network internal to BRICS and in societies that don't respect human rights and freedom of speech. So could they do something to those societies to change them into liberal societies? I don't know an answer. I think that's an important question. So also, another is that if the academic networks depend on a liberal society in order to be beneficial, but also reinforce them, then you have this opportunity for a vicious circle where the erosion of one is strengthening the erosion of the other. So, but then the question is, how can we turn this? What can we see as shocks or interventions that could help us turn a vicious circle into a virtuous circle where strengthening both? Is there anything that comes from the outside that could strengthen either liberal society and then academic networks? Or in particular, I would be interested in what could strengthen academic networks in a way that counter that vicious circle. So those are the questions that are turning in my head. I don't have any answers.
I will give the word to Kai and then to you at the end as a summing up.
I also wanted to address this question you raised, Ambassador, about liberal democracies. If we are not to cooperate and exchange ideas and trade, etc., with countries that are not liberal democracies, it seems in the world that we have fewer and fewer partners. So is that a viable way to go. I will answer the question myself. I see that you wanted to answer it also, but I would say absolutely not. Absolutely not. We have to trade, cooperate scientifically, we talk politically, expose each other to our cultures, etc., etc. It's the only viable way to break through that barrier of values that you're pointing to. You know, I'm very afraid of an attitude which is, we will cooperate with them, and then through that we will change their ideas. That's our objective. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. We have to respect the fact that we don't have to respect their values, but the culture, the identity, etc., of people who live in other systems than ours. That to me is very important. And if we don't do that, we will never get started again. And we here up in the north of Europe, we will become rather lonely small countries working together. So I think look at China. Yes, we will have to compete with China. There's no doubt. We will have to compete very, very hard with China. And we will have to learn from China. And we will have to cooperate with China. There is no way around. If not, we will not solve the climate crisis. We will not be able to control the constant growth of new armaments. No, we're doomed to do that, and we can do it. But there's one thing that I have learned through my 50 years of career, and that is we fail to demonstrate respect. Not respect for a system, but respect for a people, for individuals, also for leaders. And I remember in Afghanistan, Karzai was so furious. Why was that? Because he felt that he was treated as a, as a colony, and not as a sovereign state. But our hybris in Europe and at NATO, for instance, I spent 12 years in your capital at NATO, and the hybris that developed in the beginning of this century was frighteningly dangerous to all of us, and it's still there. I'm not attacking you, even if you're...
In the profiles of countries, I think there's a vast grey spectrum in between the extremes with regard of profiles of countries. And I quite agree with you that the Free West, as we like to call it, could have and should have shown a bit more understanding and respect to the viewpoints of other sides of the world. But I do also think that that is something else than my plea for caution, for manipulation and infiltration when dealing with those scientists that are allowed by totalitarian regimes to come into international contact. So perhaps we don't disagree on many points, but I think you covered a far larger spectrum of questions than I did.
Now the final word is to Hilligje.
So that's a very dangerous thing to do. Let's wrap it up. What I wrote at the top of my page is the importance of dialogue. Keep the dialogue open always. Because if we do not, we will just only lose. It's not possible to block knowledge out, to stop partnerships, cooperation. It's impossible to think that we can be cautious and define the cautiousness and be very sure that we have the right person in front of us or not. And no matter how we will organize ourselves, and I really hope we can move very quickly away from guidelines that would be developed by the European Commission to tell the universities in Europe how to behave when it comes to partnerships with the rest of the world. That will be the death of innovation, that will be the death of creativity, etc. But the other point that I very much support is this importance of understanding the rest of the world. We don't, and we do not actually engage with the rest of the world. We do not look at the east of Europe. We don't look at the south of our globe. We do not value South-South cooperation. We only think about ourselves. We're extremely selfish. We're only afraid that we will lose out, that we will have to do better. We will never do better if the rest of the world is not doing better. And so when the IAU goes places around the world, I receive so many questions. We met in Qatar. So many phone calls. What are you doing? Meeting in Qatar, and what do you think with slavery there? Da, da, da. I said, come and see for yourself and work with them. We met in Kigali in October. No, you cannot go to Rwanda now. They're at war with the neighbors. And what happens? Well, then Belgium, you have a particular viewpoint. France has another one, going to Rwanda. I mean, the Brits, it's extremely important to be in Rwanda today. It's the most secure place, it's the most interesting place in that part of Africa, connecting to Kenya, to Uganda, to the Congo, to many parts. And the University of Rwanda in the middle of it, which has totally changed from Francophone to Anglophone. I've seen the transition because I've been there 20 years back and now, and I see how the country is changing, but we also see and can pinpoint where any new war can start any moment if we do not pay attention. So many people called, how can you meet there? And is it dangerous? And what do I need to bring? And what kind of an insurance do I need? I said, come to the conference and feel confident, and I will be there, and I can assure you that it will work. So it's a big responsibility because I then am kind of warrant for security for 300 people who came. But it worked, and these people came to me and said it was a unique opportunity to see by ourselves, yes, that we can engage and that we have to engage. Because the 300 people who came not only from there. They came from Nigeria, they came from Niger, they came from Cameroon or Benin, so all these different places where the connections are not made if you don't meet the people. And you need a dialogue to start, an initial conversation, and then to accept to read the books from that country, to watch the films and movies from those countries, to listen to theater, to understand the sciences, to understand how it connects, to understand how these universities are organized. Then to also go to the linguistic sides and go to and I'm like you, I think we need both, and very precise sciences, and then connect when we have a very good knowledge of a discipline, then move to inter and cross-disciplinary approaches to what we have to learn together through these connections. So back to the top of my page, dialogue is the key.
I think on that note, we will end, and there's plenty of opportunities for dialogue in the other room, where we'll have some refreshments and some finger food. And thank you so much to the speakers and the commentators.